The orphan shared his only bread. Next morning, 200 warriors knocked on his door. Now he stands frozen on his porch, watching as mounted Apache warriors fill the valley before his tiny cabin. Their war paint glistens in the morning sun, feathers and beads swaying in the wind as they encircle his home. The orphan's fingers tremble against the doorframe, his last bullet spent days ago. The warrior's expressions are stone, unreadable as granite. Behind him, something rustles in the darkness of his cabin, the source of all this trouble, the reason these warriors have come. The war chief at the center raises his hand, and 200 warriors go still as statues. In that silence, the orphan can hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, feel sweat trickling down his spine, despite the morning chill. If 200 warriors surrounded your home at dawn, would you face them with empty hands, or would you hide and pray they pass you by? But what happened in the next heartbeat would change the frontier forever. 3 days earlier, Thomas Blackwood woke before the sun as he always did. His cabin, barely more than 4 walls of rough-hewn pine with gaps that whistled in the wind, sat alone in a small valley where the foothills met the plains. At 17, Thomas had been on his own for 5 years, ever since the fever took both his parents within days of each other. He dug their graves himself behind the cabin, marking them with crosses made from branches bound with strips of his mother's apron. The homestead was all he had left. The floorboards creaked under his bare feet as Thomas kindled the fire in his small stove, blowing gently on the embers until flames licked at the kindling. His hands, calloused and scarred beyond their years, moved with practiced efficiency. The morning ritual continued as he checked his food stores with growing concern. A handful of beans, a small jar of salt, and a single loaf of bread remained. Winter was approaching, and game had been scarce. His traps had been empty for days. The stream that once teemed with fish ran clear and vacant. Thomas divided the bread carefully, half for today, half for tomorrow. Then he would need to make the long journey to Fort Laramie, trading the pelts he'd collected for supplies to last the winter. He could already imagine the Fort sutler's dismissive glance at his meager offering. Outside, the sky was turning from black to deep blue. Thomas wrapped himself in his father's old coat, now patched in a dozen places. The air held the bite of coming winter. Frost crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the stream to fill his water bucket. Overhead, a hawk circled, its cry piercing the morning silence, hunting, like him, with dwindling hope. If stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. The morning passed in familiar routine. Thomas repaired a leak in the roof, carefully placing pine pitch in the gaps between boards. He chopped wood until his shoulders ached, the rhythmic thunk of the axe echoing across the valley. He checked his traps again, empty, of course. His reflection in the stream showed a face too thin, eyes too old. Sometimes he struggled to remember his parents' faces, and this frightened him more than the coming winter. As the sun reached its peak, he paused by the small stream that ran near his cabin, dipping his hands in the cold water. That's when he heard it, a soft moan, almost lost in the gurgle of the stream. Thomas froze, listening intently. The frontier had taught him caution. Sound carried deception as easily as truth. There it was again, not an animal, human. Pain and exhaustion in that sound. Following the source, Thomas moved cautiously upstream, his hand on the knife at his belt, his father's knife, the handle worn smooth from years of use. The underbrush grew thicker here, wild rose bushes with thorns that caught at his clothes. Around a bend in the stream, sheltered by a fallen cottonwood, he found them. 2 young Apache women, barely older than girls. One lay unconscious, her breathing shallow, a deep gash across her forehead crusted with dried blood. Her dress, not traditional Apache clothing, but the plain cotton of mission garments, was torn and muddy. The other knelt protectively over her sister, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion as she spotted Thomas. Her hair hung in tangled waves, and a bruise darkened one cheekbone. She raised her hand, palm outward. not in surrender, but warning. Though they spoke different languages, her meaning was clear. Come closer, and I will fight to my last breath. Thomas saw the desperation in her eyes, the way her body trembled with exhaustion, yet remained coiled to strike. The unconscious girl's lips were cracked from dehydration, her cheeks hollow. Both wore torn dresses, mission clothes, and their feet were bloodied from hard travel. They were running from something or someone. Thomas had heard stories of the mission schools, whispered accounts that made his stomach turn. Thomas slowly raised his empty hands, then pointed to himself, then to his cabin in the distance. The conscious girl shook her head fiercely. Thomas mimicked drinking, eating, and pointed again to his cabin. He stepped back, giving them space, showing he meant no harm. A crow called from a nearby tree, making the girl flinch. "Water," he said softly, pointing to the stream, then to the unconscious girl. "She needs water, food, shelter." He doubted she understood his words, but perhaps his tone would reach her. The girl hesitated, looking down at her unconscious sister, whose breathing seemed to grow more labored by the moment. A decision formed in her eyes, not trust, not yet, but desperate necessity. She made her choice with a reluctant nod. Thomas approached slowly, helping to lift the unconscious girl. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, light as fallen leaves. The conscious sister gathered herself to her feet, swaying with exhaustion, but refusing Thomas's offered hand. Back at his cabin, he gave them his only blanket, built up the fire until warmth filled the single room, and cleaned the wound on the unconscious girl's head with water boiled with pine needles, the way his mother had taught him. The conscious sister watched his every move, never relaxing her vigilance. She positioned herself between Thomas and her sister, her back to the wall, her eyes tracking his hands. When Thomas approached with a cloth soaked in pine water, she took it from him, unwilling to let him touch her sister directly. Her care was gentle despite her obvious exhaustion. When he offered them his half loaf of bread, the only food he had left until he could check his traps again, the girl shook her head. Thomas insisted, breaking it in two and placing half in her hand, then using the remaining beans to make a thin broth. Only when her sister began to stir did the girl finally eat, her eyes never leaving Thomas. She tore the bread into small pieces, chewing each slowly, as if to make it last forever. Thomas recognized the habit. He did the same when food was scarce. As night fell, Thomas made a pallet for himself outside the cabin, gathering pine boughs to soften the cold ground. He would not make them feel trapped. Under the stars, he wondered what trouble these pearls were running from and what it might bring to his door. The territories were volatile, conflict between settlers and tribes, between the army and the Apache, between different bands of Apache themselves. Thomas had kept to himself, neutral ground in other people's wars, but neutrality was a luxury that might soon be beyond his reach. Dawn broke cold and clear, the eastern sky painted in streaks of gold and crimson. Thomas woke stiff and chilled to find the conscious girl standing over him, no longer fearful but curious. The early light caught in her dark eyes, revealing flecks of amber. She pointed to herself and said, "Nita," then to her sister inside, "Kimi." "Thomas," he replied, touching his chest. Nita nodded, then made a series of gestures. Riders, soldiers, a mission building sketched in the air with her finger. Thomas understood fragments. They had escaped from somewhere. The White River Mission, he guessed, some 30 miles south. Soldiers were looking for them. They needed to reach their people to the north, in the shadow of the Cloud Peak Mountains. Thomas checked his traps. Miraculously, 2 rabbits had wandered in overnight. As he approached the second trap, he noticed fresh tracks in the soft earth nearby. Moccasin prints. Someone had been watching his cabin. He scanned the ridgeline, but saw no movement. He scanned and cooked the rabbits, giving most of the meat to the girls. The rich aroma filled the cabin, making his own stomach growl painfully. Kimi had awakened, weak but alert. By midday, color had returned to her cheeks. Her eyes, unlike her sister's, held no suspicion, only curiosity. She pointed to Thomas's worn book on the shelf, his mother's Bible, and made a gesture like turning pages. "You can read?" he asked, surprised. Kimmy nodded. "Mission," she said softly, her first spoken word to him. Her expression clouded, memories darkening her features. Thomas knew he should take them north, help them find their people. But the journey would be dangerous. If soldiers were looking for them, they might assume Thomas had kidnapped them. And if other settlers saw him with Apache girls, they might shoot first and ask questions never. The territory was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That afternoon, 3 riders appeared on the ridge above his cabin. Thomas hurried the girls inside. Through a crack in the shutters, he saw the men clearly. Not soldiers, but settlers from the distant town, rough men known for taking Apache scalps for bounty. Their horses were lathered, pushed hard. They'd been searching, and not for innocent reasons. Would you hide 2 strangers from men who wished them harm, knowing it might cost you everything you have? Thomas stepped outside as the men approached, casually leaning his rifle against the wall beside him. He spat in the dust, affecting nonchalance he didn't feel. "Afternoon," the lead rider called, a man named Harkins, known for his cruelty. A red beard framed his weather-beaten face, and a necklace of what Thomas suspected were human teeth hung around his neck. "Looking for a couple Indian girls, mission runaways. Seen anything?" Thomas shook his head. "Been alone here. Haven't seen nobody in weeks." The second rider dismounted, walking toward the cabin door. Thomas recognized him, too. Denton, a man rumored to have killed his own brother over a card game. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "I mind," Thomas said quietly. "Nothing in there but my things." Denton's eyes narrowed. "What you hiding, boy?" "Boy," the lead rider said, his voice hardening. "Those Apache girls are worth good money. The mission's offering a reward. The army's offering more." He leaned forward in his saddle. "We're gonna look." Thomas stepped between them and the door, heart hammering against his ribs. "You're not welcome here. Best move on." The second man laughed. "Look at the orphan boy, playing hero." He turned to the others. "Maybe he's keeping them for himself? Got himself a couple squaws?" Thomas felt heat rise in his face, but kept his expression neutral. "I said move on." Harkins spat tobacco juice that landed inches from Thomas's boot. "You think you're safe out here because folks feel sorry for you? Orphan boy playing house?" His hand drifted to the pistol at his hip. "I'll ask one more time. You seen those girls?" "No," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "And you're trespassing." The lead rider studied Thomas, then the cabin behind him. His eyes narrowed. "We'll be back, boy, with more men. Those girls are worth more than you are." After the riders disappeared over the ridge, Thomas opened the door. Nita stood there, Kimmy behind her, both holding makeshift weapons, a cooking knife, a heavy stick. "They will return," Nita said in halting English, each word carefully formed. "More men." Thomas nodded. "We need to get you home, to your people." Nita shook her head. "Too far. Too dangerous." She stepped forward, her dark eyes meeting his. "Why help us?" Thomas thought of his parents, of the years alone, of the simple lessons they had taught him before the fever took them. His father's voice seemed to whisper from the past. A man who turns his back on suffering isn't a man at all. "Because it's right," he said simply. That evening, as they ate the last of the rabbit, Kimi spoke for the first time in full sentences. In a mixture of gestures and broken English, she explained. They had been taken from their village 2 years ago, forced into the mission school. Their brother, Ahiga, was a war chief who had been searching for them. The soldiers feared what would happen if the girls escaped and told of their treatment at the mission. The beatings, the starvation, the deaths of other children. "They cut our hair," Kimi said, touching her unevenly shorn locks. "Beat us when we speak Apache. Children die of fever, of broken hearts." Her eyes grew distant. "We escaped 3 times. This time, they will kill us if they find us." As night fell, Thomas made a decision. "Tomorrow, I'll take you north, help you find your people. But fate had other plans. Before dawn, they woke to the sound of horses, many horses. Thomas peered through the shutters to see torches approaching, at least a dozen men from town. Harkins had made good on his promise, returning with reinforcements. Out the back, he whispered urgently to the girls, into the trees. Nita shook her head. They will hunt us, kill us. I'll delay them, Thomas insisted. Give you time. But before the girls could flee, another sound rose from the darkness. War cries. From the north, shadows moved against the stars. Apache warriors, at least 20 of them, descended upon the settlers like silent wraiths. The night erupted in gunfire and screams. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from Thomas's head. Thomas barred the door, pulling the girls away from the windows. For what seemed like hours, chaos reigned outside. The flash of gunfire illuminated the cabin in staccato bursts. Then, suddenly, silence fell, heavy and complete. A heavy knock came at the door. Thomas stood before the girls, knife in hand, useless against guns, but all he had. His knuckles whitened around the handle. "Brother!" Kimmy called suddenly, rushing forward. Thomas cautiously opened the door to find a tall Apache warrior, his face painted for war. Behind him stood others, their expressions unreadable in the pre-dawn light. Their feathers and beads caught the starlight, their weapons dark with fresh blood. The warrior, Ahiga, entered, embracing his sisters. His eyes never left Thomas. Unlike the girls, he wore traditional Apache clothing. His chest crossed with ammunition belts, a Winchester rifle in his hands. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, white against his copper skin. Nita spoke rapidly in Apache, her words flowing like water after the halting English she'd used with Thomas. Ahiga listened, then addressed Thomas in perfect English. "You protected my sisters when others would have sold them. You gave them your last food." It wasn't a question, but Thomas nodded. Ahiga studied him. "The settlers are gone. They will not trouble you again." He paused. "My sisters say you are alone here." "I am." "The winter comes. You have no food." Thomas straightened. "I'll manage." Ahiga nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Tomorrow I will return." With that, he and his warriors vanished into the night, taking Nita and Kimi with them. The sisters glanced back at Thomas, Kimi raising her hand in farewell, Nita giving him a solemn nod that carried the weight of a promise. Thomas stood in his doorway long after they had gone, wondering if he had imagined the entire encounter. The only evidence was the trampled earth around his cabin, a few scattered eagle feathers, and the half-eaten rabbit stew still warm on his table. Outside, the settlers' horses had fled, but dark stains marked the earth where men had fallen. The next day, Thomas woke to silence. His cabin seemed emptier than before, though it had held the girls for just 2 days. He checked the ridge where the settlers had appeared. Nothing moved there now. His traps were empty again. He had no food, no ammunition for his rifle. The winter would be hard, perhaps impossible to survive. He thought of the graves behind his cabin, wondered if he would soon join his parents there. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas resigned himself to the long walk to Fort Laramie, though he had too few pelts to trade for what he needed. Perhaps he could find work there for the winter. He packed his few valuables, his mother's Bible, his father's compass, a daguerreotype of his parents on their wedding day. Then he saw them. First, one rider on the ridge, then another, then dozens more appearing like spirits from the morning mist. Apache warriors, their faces painted, feathered lances catching the sunlight. Thomas counted quickly. At least 200 of them, forming a great semicircle around his cabin. Their horses stamped and snorted, sending puffs of steam into the cold air. And now he stands on his porch, watching as they advance. He recognizes Ahiga at their center, flanked by Nita and Kimi. Thomas steps forward, his legs unsteady but his back straight. He has no weapons, no defenses. If this is to be his end, he will meet it standing. A jay screams from a nearby tree, the only sound in the valley besides the soft creak of leather and jingle of bridles. If you were surrounded by 200 warriors, would you make peace with your fate or beg for mercy? The warriors halt in perfect unison. Ahiga raises his hand, and two braves come forward, leading a magnificent painted pony loaded with bundles. Behind them, others lead horses carrying deer carcasses, baskets of corn, dried berries, and smoked fish. The smell of jerky and smoked venison reaches Thomas, making his empty stomach clench. Ahiga dismounts, walking toward Thomas. The war chief's face is no longer painted for battle, but adorned with symbols of peace. Blue stripes across his cheekbones, ochre around his eyes. My sisters told our people of your kindness, how you shared your last bread, how you stood between them and danger. He gestures to the supplies. The winter will not defeat you now. Thomas stares in disbelief at the procession of food and supplies. I don't understand. Our ways are not your ways, Ahiga says, but honor is understood by all men. You honored my sisters with your protection. We honor you with our protection. From around his neck, Ahiga removes a medicine pouch decorated with intricate beadwork, blue and white beads forming the shape of an eagle in flight. This belonged to my father, and his father before him. It carries the spirit of the eagle, who sees far and stands alone, yet is never truly alone. He places it around Thomas's neck. Wear this, and all Apache will know you as friend. Thomas's fingers close around the pouch, feeling its weight, not just of the object itself, but of its meaning. Inside, he can feel small objects shifting, sacred items he would never presume to examine. I have nothing to give in return. Ahiga smiles for the first time. You gave what was most precious, your last bread when you yourself were hungry. There is no greater gift. His hand rests briefly on Thomas's shoulder. My people say the measure of wealth is not what you gather, but what you give away. Kimi steps forward, placing something in Thomas's hand. Seeds. Small, dark seeds he recognizes as corn, beans, and squash. For spring, she says in her limited English, new life. Her smile is shy but genuine. Nita approaches, touching the medicine pouch. You are not orphan now, she says simply. You are brother. Her words are few, but her eyes hold a depth of meaning that transcends language. The warriors raise their lances, a salute that echoes across the valley. Winter sunlight gleams on metal points and painted shields. As they prepare to depart, Ahiga gives Thomas one last message. When the snow flies, light a fire each night. We will watch from the hills. No harm will come to you. As swiftly as they appeared, the Apache warriors vanish into the hills, leaving Thomas with supplies to survive 3 winters, not just one. That night, he sits before his fire, the medicine pouch against his chest, and feels for the first time in 5 years that he is not alone. Outside, the first snowflakes begin to fall, dancing in the firelight that spills through his window. Word spread quickly across the frontier. Settlers who once shunned the orphan boy now approached with cautious respect. Soldiers who heard the tale gave his cabin wide berth. When spring came, Thomas planted kimi seeds alongside his own crops. The corn grew taller than any the settlers had seen. The beans climbed the stalks as if reaching for the sky, and the squash spread across the ground, their yellow flowers bright against the earth. Throughout the years that followed, Thomas's cabin became a place where both settlers and Apache could meet in peace, a neutral ground where disputes were settled with words instead of bullets. Where others saw enemies, he saw only people. The orphan who shared his last bread became a bridge between 2 worlds. His simple act of kindness expanding into something that changed the course of the frontier. When others ask why he risked everything for strangers, Thomas touches the medicine pouch he still wears and answers, "A man with nothing to give but kindness is richer than he knows, and a man who sees only enemies will always be surrounded by them." Years later, when the Indian Wars raged across the territories, Thomas's valley remained untouched, an island of peace in a sea of conflict. Children of both settlers and Apache played together by the stream, where once he had found two desperate girls. And when Thomas finally married a schoolteacher from back east with kind eyes and gentle hands, Ahiga stood beside him as a brother might, the two men united by a loaf of bread shared when hunger threatened them both. Would you have shared your last bread with strangers in need, knowing the risk, but not knowing the reward that might follow? Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.